Today at COP28, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced new methane emissions regulations for the Canadian oil and gas industry. To talk about those, I'm joined by Janetta McKenzie from the Pembina Institute. So welcome to the interview, Janetta.
Thanks for having me, Markham.
Look, give us an overview of the announcement today, please.
Yeah, so this morning at a global methane event, the Minister for ECCC announced the draft regulations for methane for oil and gas to 2030. This is building on existing regulations that go to 2025. And these draft regulations are aiming to reduce methane from oil and gas by at least 75% by 2030. So a pretty ambitious target, and well in line with our American counterparts who announced a similar target over the weekend.
Yeah, I think that's something that we need to focus on because, the oil and gas leadership in Alberta, plus the Alberta government, often says that we shouldn't get too far out in front of the Americans, who are our customers. And the industry here has very close connections to the industry in the US, but here they appear to be aligned.
They do. They are quite well aligned. These newly finalized rules from the Environmental Protection Agency are quite in lockstep with what the Canadian federal government has announced. And beyond the United States, we've also seen a few weeks ago an announcement from the EU for a methane intensity standard that will apply to imports of oil and gas, also starting 2030. So this is definitely something that our trading partners and our neighbors are making big moves on. And so this announcement, these draft regulations, are a step for Canada, not to go out in front, but to stay in step with our colleagues and our peers and maintain some global leadership on the methane space.
Now, the Pembina Institute, you welcome these new regulations, but I've also interviewed Jan Gorski when he was with the Pembina, and you folks were pushing for Canada to be even more ambitious, maybe to a 95%, because methane emissions are the low-hanging fruit in the oil and gas industry. So do you think that Canada can go beyond what it announced today?
Yeah, and methane is definitely the low-hanging fruit for oil and gas emissions. It's low cost. Much of it can be mitigated with technology that's available now off the shelf, or for actions like increasing detection, like surveys for leak detection and repairing those leaks. So there is definitely room to be quite ambitious on methane. And these draft regulations do leave room to go beyond the 75%. They're aiming for at least a 75% reduction in methane emissions. So there's room to surpass the 75 by 2030. And this is also something that in some ways industry is moving on, because they also recognize, right, that it's a low-hanging fruit for them for emissions reductions. At this COP, 50 oil companies globally announced that they would aim to end routine flaring by 2030, for instance. And we also, there's an established oil and gas climate initiative where 12 big global oil companies aim to get to near zero methane by 2030. So this 75% is pretty much in lockstep with what we see from the US, and there's room to go beyond.
What exactly is it that the regulations will prohibit or regulate?
Yeah, so there's a few kind of moving pieces to these regulations. One thing that they do compared to the 2025 is they reduce the number of exemptions. So the other side of that is they're expanding coverage of the existing regulations to make sure that we get at more of the emissions that we know are there. So that's one thing that they're doing. They're also aiming to reduce and then eventually get rid of routine venting and flaring. Again, this is something that we've seen from our colleagues in the EU. This is a sort of natural next step. So those are some of the specific actions that these regulations are going to encourage or incentivize. They also include a performance-based standard that firms can choose to opt into by doing things like installing continuous measurement of methane emissions at their facilities, because we know that methane emissions are underestimated. So that's one way to combat that. So there's a few different approaches included in these regulations, but the main thing they're doing is tightening and expanding what's already there.
Yeah, measurement's always been a problem in this industry because the technology up until recently was actually kind of primitive. You had a little thermal gun and you went out to your tanks or your battery or your pipelines, whatever it was, and you know once a year, maybe twice a year at most, you took a reading and that was your emissions. But of course, we know that methane emissions fluctuate over time in terms of you know the volume that's being released. And but now there's all sorts of remote sensing technologies that can give you methane emissions readings in pretty much real time. And we've just seen some studies come out not that long ago that shows that Canada is underestimating its methane emissions from oil and gas by what, about 50%?
Yeah, yeah. And we're beginning to see that kind of convergence from a bunch of different peer-reviewed academic studies. And Canada's certainly not alone on this. Everybody underestimates methane. As you say, it's been hard to measure in the past, and it hasn't been a priority to measure. But as the technology to measure methane and to detect leaks has gotten better, we're starting to get a better idea of the true baseline that we're working from. And that is also something that these draft regulations are aiming to improve through two ways. One is by requiring more of those surveys where you go out and you see what equipment is leaking and how badly it's leaking. So doing that more frequently for many types of facilities. And the other is, this isn't the regulations, but this was sort of announced in conjunction, is funding to a methane center of excellence that will focus on measurement, on how to better measure methane. And that is also a really key piece of the announcement today.
Janetta, what exactly will this methane center of excellence do? I mean, I hadn't heard of it before, and it seems to me that you know the industry is kind of on top of this. I mean, you know, between them and consultants and academics, there are now there are satellite methane sniffing technologies. There are all sorts of things, and it's not clear to me what a center of excellence will add to the work that's going on in the private sector and academia.
Well, the biggest thing is that it will, a center like this, the parameters of which are still very much being defined. We don't have the details of exactly what this center will be doing or what role it will take in improving measurement in Canadian methane. But one of the biggest things it will do is not be ad hoc, right? You pointed out that there are academics working on this. There are some firms that are working on this, and that's true. But this would be a really great forum to centralize a lot of the different types of ways that people are going about measuring methane emissions, and would consolidate a lot of that information, which could then help lead back in to things like our national inventory report. And so it would be less of a, you know, who's deciding to do this, and more of a funded, established, centralized center where we could figure out what's working, figure out what's not, and figure out what's most cost effective.
Well, Janetta, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Markham.